Good evening and welcome. My name is Ed Hashig. I'm the president of FAB, and I want to welcome all our FAB members and friends to this special FAB Presents about the legendary Bob Avian. On January 7th of this year, I had the wonderful opportunity to record an introduction with Bob that we plan to use for tonight's FAB Presents. And Bob has been just a dear friend of mine for a number of years. But sadly, on January 21st, Bob passed away. Peter Pileski, Bob's husband, wanted us still to share this recording for the FAB audience. So I raised a glass to the legendary Bob Avian. I'm so pleased that we can still introduce Bob to all of you. He was an amazing, talented, kind, and generous man, and simply Broadway treasure. Bob moved to Fort Lauderdale with Peter in the 90s and lived here during the winter seasons. Bob and Peter have been active with the Miami Ballet, Lambda Legal, Island City Stage, Our Fund, Community Foundation of Broward, and many other organizations. We so appreciate all their support in our community. Bob started as a dancer in the 60s and then progressed to choreographer and eventually musical production director. His book called Dancing Man, A Choreographer's Journey beautifully describes his career through some of the most well-known musicals of our time. Now, as recorded on January 7th, I'm incredibly pleased to introduce Bob's comments before he provides his introduction to his July of 2020 interview with his co-writer, Todd San Pietro. So, without further ado, here's Bob.
Much for giving me this opportunity. I really respect the great work done by Funding Arts Broward in their 17 years of supporting the arts here in South Florida. I look back and see how fortunate I've been to be part of so many great Broadway productions, and I've had to work with such an array of creative people. I wrote my memoir, Dancing Man, in 2020, and it certainly was a journey down memory lane. I realize how lucky I am to have had such a memorable 60-year run. Wow. In 2020, I did an interview with my co-author, Tom Santapietro, at the Public Library in Kent, Connecticut, which we will now share with you. By the way, the recorded interview begins after the first 2 minutes when I'm discussing my Broadway debut, A West Side Story, with the brilliant but very difficult director, Jerome Robbins. Please enjoy, and thanks again to FAB for asking me to share stories from my memoir, Dancing Man. And out comes Leonard Bernstein, raised high in the pit with a satin cape and the long hair, and the audience went wild. So he achieved what the producers were going for.
Oh, it's such a great opening night story. That does not happen all the time.
No.
And could you just talk for a little bit about, dancing for Robbins? Because we all know the stories about how difficult he could be with dancers. And what was your experience?
Well, he was the first Broadway choreographer I was in the room with, so to speak. And everybody was deathly afraid of him because he had a mean mouth, I would say.
Okay.
And he was so critical and so hard on us that we would all try and dance in the background before he could see us. But he was an amazing artist. No one can take that away.
Right.
And when you're that good, that's when you are that severe. And it was tough going, but ultimately it was worth every moment.
Yeah. Well, you were a part of the Broadway history. And so it was on, you met your great friend, Michael Bennett, on the tour in the
Yes.
international tour?
When we closed that company on
Mhm,
Broadway,
mhm,
the next month they got together a new cast to do this international tour of West Side Story
mhm,
that would start in Israel and then play all through Europe,
mm,
Italy, France, Germany, or whatever. And I got picked to be in it. And the first couple of days in the rehearsal room, I meet this young kid, Michael Bennett, who quit high school so he could be in it.
mm.
He was 17 years old. And my best friend in the show was a girl named Audrey, and she liked the younger men. And eventually they became a couple. And that's how I got so close to him, because the three of us would hang out all the time.
Right.
And we bonded so quickly. And I kept saying to myself, I can't believe this guy is 17 years old. I was 22 at the time. But we did bond and we became very close friends.
And it makes me, one of the things I was always curious about is, was there any particular moment where the extent of Michael's gifts, the extent of his talent really became clear to you? Was it when he was dancing, or was it when he started to choreograph?
What he was very ambitious. I
Mhm.
learned that very quickly. But he invited me to see his first good summer stock job, which was a production of No Strings. And I went out of town and I saw it and I went, holy moly, Captain Marvel, I am blown away. This is amazing. And I knew he had the gift.
And so then that, led to, you started to assist Michael on various shows, and Henry Sweet Henry. And I was hoping you would, well, I want to get into the Michael shows, but we have to backtrack chronologically. Sorry about that, because I want to go back to your career as a dancer. And so you were, as you point out in the book, in a lot of flops in a short period of time.
Yeah, I did 4 shows in one season. I
That
was never out of rehearsal. Yeah.
And you said that the first time you actually were able to be out of rehearsal with a steady paycheck on a Broadway show was when you joined Funny Girl. Was it a week after opening? Very quickly.
Yes, they needed what they call a swing boy,
Mhm.
which is somebody who understudies all the male singers and dancers in the company.
Right.
It was an overwhelming job. I had no idea what I was getting into,
Right.
but it was daunting, believe me.
And when you started, I think, you have such a unique perspective. We're now, 50 years later, 60 years later almost, so used to Barbara Streisand being a part of the cultural landscape. What was it like when she was so young? I mean, that's when she exploded on the scene.
Yes, it was her recording career that exploded.
Hmm.
And then getting her as the star of the show put it over the top. And you couldn't get a ticket, and the stars coming to see it were amazing. After the show, we could barely get out of the theater, both the front entrance and the back entrance. Of course, in the audience every night was Liz Taylor and Richard Burton, Audrey Hepburn, all the biggest stars in the world.
Right.
And she was quite a magnet for publicity and for glamour and for attention.
And I was struck by you when we were talking about Funny Girl for the book, just her. You referred to both her extraordinary work ethic, the showing up, doing the recordings, the 8 shows a week, and also kind of a sense that you thought, oh, she's going to be on her way to Hollywood. She has targets beyond Broadway.
Oh, definitely. I
Yeah,
mean, she sold the show.
right.
She was the show. I remember the first night I watched it to learn it. I
Hmm.
hadn't seen it before.
Right.
And my first impression at the end of the evening was, she's amazing. The show is not so hot, and but she made it work, and the audience loved it.
Yeah.
But she already had like 2 major hit albums out, and she was also doing her television specials, concerts, and recording while she was in the show. But she always showed up. I think the 1 year I was in the show, she missed one performance. Of course, she made adjustments so she could get through it. She put in cuts, maybe cut a song or whatever, but she was always there.
Yeah. With that nuclear generator inside her, with that,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, somebody like Streisand or Sinatra has, where they just have to keep going.
Well,
And
she was the reason for the
right,
show. And without her, it was not much news.
right, right. So after Funny Girl and after Hello Dolly, when you started um, assisting Michael, Henry Sweet Henry, and could you talk a little bit about that original production of Promises that you were the associate choreographer on? And uh, I was really struck by when you talked about uh, both the Turkey Lurkey number that became the showstopper, and at the other end of the spectrum, the show's big hit song, I'll Never Fall in Love Again.
Yeah. Well, when Michael asked me to do the first show, Henry Sweet Henry, he just automatically asked me to keep working with him. I wasn't sure if I was going to be rehired or whether, but when I'm doing Ed Sullivan Show or Kraft Music Hall or any other project that would come up, he'd just say, okay, Bobby, we're going to start rehearsals this such a day. Okay. And then when he got Promises, which was a big show for that coming season, it was a real feather in his hat.
Right.
He took me right on board and included me in everything. And I felt very much at home because we were best friends. And I was so lucky about that. And he watched over me, I watched over him. And we realized this is potentially the big hit of the year. So we were nervous, but we did it. And then when we were out of town, the first preview, we didn't have the big Sacco number we needed in the show. Michael looked at me and said, we got to find it. And the next day we were in the hotel ballroom next door putting Turkey Lurkey together. And of course it became the showstopper and the fun number of the evening. Yeah.
And then was it I'll Never Fall in Love Again? Was that also, did that go in out of town, or was that part of the score originally? Or
Went in out of town as well.
okay.
And we could get the number in instantly because Jill O'Hara, the leading lady, could play the guitar. So we put it in without an orchestration instantly, which was a first for me. I had never seen that. And then over the days, the orchestra started sneaking in.
Right.
But Turkey Lurkey was the big production number, and Never Fall in Love Again was the big hit ballad. There's nothing like going out of town or the show.
Oh, and you told the story, which I just loved, about the fact that the production assistant gopher on the show part of the time was Angie Dickinson.
Yeah, Burt Bacharach's wife.
Yeah.
They were a dream to work with. Neil Simon, Burt Bacharach, Hal David. And Angie would hang around. And if we were casting or doing production rehearsals, Angie would say, can I get you boys lunch? And we go, sure, turkey on rye. And she would do it.
The most glamorous gopher in the history of Broadway.
Absolutely.
So after Promises, and obviously you have this great working relationship with Michael. And of course, then came Coco, which is just fascinating on all sorts of levels. And I guess what I really wanted to talk about is, and we say this in the book, you and Michael saw very right away that Katharine Hepburn was not a singer and not a dancer. But how did you work around her shortcomings? And then could you talk about how your relationship with her changed? Because you said it really did over the course of the show.
Yes, well, we had to do pre-production with her. We brought her onto the empty stage. It was just her and Michael and I and a piano player, and just tried to see how she could move. Well, she couldn't move a step. She couldn't walk in tempo. She just didn't even know what music was.
Right.
And Michael and I that night on the phone crying, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? But eventually we worked it out, and she was very resistant. She wanted to control everything. She wanted to direct. If we said, all right, you'll come on from stage left, and she would go, I'll be goddamn if I'm coming out from stage left. I'm coming from stage right. We went, okay, whatever you want. And we kept on adjusting to that. So we would then start saying, we want you to come down the stairs, knowing she'd say she wouldn't, and then would do the entrance we wanted, you know. But that changed pretty quickly. And she started understanding what Michael's talent was. And ultimately, we did things like sit around the edge of the stage like Judy Garland to be the focus of a huge production number. But it worked. And the audiences loved her. When the curtain finally went up, it was like, you know, a football game.
Right.
Because she was so charismatic, and the audience paid a lot of money to see her.
And it sounded like by the time the tour went out, and you point out that she said she wanted to do the tour because the show hadn't paid back at that point.
Yes.
And it sounded like by then she really trusted you and Michael, and it was a much easier relationship.
Yeah, and also she had 8 months of the show under her belt.
Right.
So she was secure and was not nervous about anything anymore.
Right.
So she was braver and stronger and could take the musical sections of the show and deliver them. And on the tour, the business we did was unbelievable. We were playing the biggest monster theaters in America, and they were putting folding chairs in the aisle.
Wow.
We went, oh, the check this week is going to be good.
Right. Right. Hence, you're calling Coco your smash flop.
Yes. It was a disappointment, though, artistically, because it wasn't the show that we wanted to deliver. But it was a hit, and it just should have had a different star, if I say so myself.
Right. Maybe the other Hepburn.
Yes, that would have been nice.
So, Bob, then when you and Michael back to back, Company and Follies, and I was struck when we would have these discussions about the shows, and you said several times when Company was in rehearsal or even in the production meetings, just the sense of almost an intellectual excitement about it, to see these incredibly smart people really working at the top of their games.
It was awesome, so intimidating to be in the room with Hal Prince, Stephen Sondheim, George Firth, and Michael being able to deliver and talk about the structure of the show and molding it and shaping it. It was very intimidating. I just kept my little mouth shut and took it all in, you know, but it was so exciting. And Company was the kind of show I had never done before or seen before. So that was a whole new experience, an experiment.
Right. And when because again, now 50 years later, we're used to Company, but then it was so startling. And when you had those first previews in Boston, when you were trying out, what was the reaction? What were you getting from the audience?
Very mixed. Some people thought it was the greatest thing they ever saw.
Right.
And many people were walking up the aisles and leaving the show because they perceived it as being anti-marriage.
Right.
And it wasn't that. In fact, it was the opposite. But it had an intellectual subtext to the whole evening. Or it made fun of marriage or pointed out the foolhardy marriages. and it was thrilling to sit and watch that show every night. Most times when you do a show, you know, you can't wait to get out of the theater. I can't watch this again.
Right.
But Company, I could always watch it.
Yeah. Well, there's the there's the ultimate quote ad for it. And the same. So you followed that. I think it was one year after another with Follies and another groundbreaking show. And first, you made me laugh when we were talking about Follies the first time, because you said Michael gave you the script and you thought, I don't even understand what's going on.
Yeah, because nothing was going on. And eventually, you know, it all settled down and we discovered it because it was a transformation. The original script was a murder mystery. And Hal loved the concept of all these old timers coming to a reunion.
Mm-hmm.
But the plot wasn't working. So eventually, with the team, James Goldman being the author, rewrote it into a remembrance and a reliving of the days of the follies that these people were involved with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so when you were putting it together, and I know you said you had to, I believe you rehearsed at the scenic studio because of the complicated nature of the show.
And many of the cast members were so old that they needed the experience of being on the set at all times.
Right. And when you and Michael were working with them and you put together the Who's That Woman number, the mirror number, as everybody calls it, I guess I have two questions about that. Number one is, have you ever rehearsed a number more often than that number?
Never.
That's what I thought.
It was hard too, because the ladies in the number, not the chorus, but the ladies were all mature in their 50s and 60s. And one of the actresses, Helen Blount, wore a pedometer on her ankle. And one day said, Michael, we've done 60 miles on this number. And I really felt so bad. I went, oh my God, they're dying, you know. But it was something we had to do.
Yeah.
And it became famous, that number.
And did you know it was going to be this showstopper, or did it take you by surprise in Boston when it?
I thought it would be a showstopper,
mm-hmm.
but not to the extent that it was.
Right.
And the audience went wild, just wild. And it was an iffy kind of evening because it was not a happy-go-lucky musical.
Right.
And then this number comes along and the audience went berserk. It was great. Very fulfilling, to say the least.
And so it really had that same split reaction that Company did, of people who just thought it was the greatest thing they'd ever seen and others who wanted no part of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the traditionalists, you know, didn't want that, especially with a title like that. They didn't want experimentation and not too much thinking, you know. They wanted just pure entertainment.
Sure. Because it was the wasn't Follies the same year as No No Nanette? You know,
following year.
Okay.
Yeah. But, you know, we lost the best Tony to Two Gentlemen of Verona. Now, how many times have we seen Two Gentlemen of Verona since then? I've never seen it. I don't have any idea what it's like.
Right. Well, and then after these acclaimed shows that ran but not huge smash hits, you started work on Chorus Line. And a lot has been said about Chorus Line, but the first thing I want to ask you about that I got such a chuckle out of is when Michael first mentioned it to you and said, oh, the dancers were going to get together, you thought, I don't want to do that. I want to go away for the weekend.
Yes, Bjork Lee and I, you know, we said, are you going to go do this? And we said, no, I'm going to the country. And you know, and that's exactly what happened. Right. But Michael brought the tape machine And God knows I heard those tapes day after day after day for a year while we worked on the show. But he got what he wanted, and he got what he needed for that show.
Right. And you talked about again, now of course it's a has been an international phenomenon since the 70s. But at first, and I don't know if this was when you did a first run through down at the Public Theater, but were there some who thought Chorus Line might almost be too insidey, too show busy?
Well, interestingly, I thought that.
Ah,
And Michael even had some doubts about it. But as we were getting ready to go towards the final steps with lighting and costumes, technical stuff, the tech people started coming in to watch the show. This is down at the Public. And people from the lighting department, spotlight operators, seamstresses, all of a sudden would look at them and they were sobbing and like so caught up and involved. And Michael and I would poke each other and go, this is looking good. But up to that point, we were never quite sure. I thought at one point it might have been too inside.
right.
But ultimately, it was just the opposite. It was about every man.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it brought you your first Tony. And do you have any memory of that night in terms of how did you feel?
I was over the moon. I was over the moon. But mostly it's so out of proportion and so gigantic, the emotions, that you don't remember too much about it, and the parties and all of that. It was fabulous, just fabulous.
And so that was Tony Award #1. Tony Award #2 came with Ballroom, that ultimately did not have the run you hoped. And yet you pointed something really interesting out to me when we were talking about it, which is in Ballroom, you weren't choreographing ensemble numbers. You had couples, all of whom had to have different steps. That must have been a huge task.
It was very difficult because everybody had to do something different all night long. And there was so much dancing. Yeah, we never stopped choreographing. And it was hard. It was hard. But the thrilling part of it was because it was about a ballroom with older people, we resurrected so many old chorus gypsies. And they came into rehearsals like they were 18 years old, so excited and so thrilled to be back at work. And by the time we opened, they were 18 years old again, and in shape and looking fabulous. I was only sad that the show didn't run long enough for them to really enjoy it.
Yeah, yeah. I know you said that they loved the experience so much they would hang out together all the time. And,
yes, and get to the theater early and stay afterwards.
Yeah,
Back where they wanted to be.
right, right. But the show you and Michael did after Ballroom, which was another smash, of course, was Dreamgirls. And I wanted to talk about when you put Dreamgirls together you had a number of workshops. And I just thought it was fascinating from a structural point of view. You said that in one of the workshops, as you were developing it, you didn't even do musical numbers. You just did the script, the whole workshop. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, there were like 4 workshops to develop it. The first 2, we didn't direct it. We just produced it. The writer was directing it, but he couldn't get ahead of it because he was too overstressed and overworked. So finally we said, Michael, you got to direct it. And he did. And we already had a choreographer, so I didn't choreograph. Although secretly, Michael and Michael Peters, the other choreographer, and I did all the choreography for the Dreams. We were the real Dreams. Anyway, we had all the musical numbers and all the the montages, they were all together and working, but the script still needed work.
Mhm.
So we spent the whole third workshop just sitting at a table, working on the words and the script and the transitions and the whole character development.
Right.
It was such an interesting experience. I had never seen that before, or I didn't think of anybody ever had the luxury, the time, and the money to do that. But here again, we were under workshop contracts, so we could get away with it.
Right. Right. And it was when one of the great sort of research tools for writing your book was when you gave me the journal you kept during the production period.
Oh,
And
yes.
it's fascinating to look back, from 40 years before. And it really struck me in multiple places before the show opened, when it was still being developed. You talked about how much you believed in that show just from the get-go. You felt a real personal ownership in it.
And it was a very important show. Talk about now with Black Lives Matter.
Right,
This was about the dignity of Black performers
right.
and their families and their respect and love for each other. And it was very groundbreaking and very important.
Yeah, yeah. An extraordinary show that continues to be revived because it still
Yeah.
speaks to people so much. And so it turned out to be the last big show you did with Michael. And when after Michael passed away, and which was when you were choreographing, rehearsing Follies in London, I want to talk about I think one of the things that interested me about doing the book is when you talked about the fact that that was you were willing to step through a new door. Everybody thinks about doing that. This was
Right.
your first time on your own. And did you have a lot of trepidation about doing it on your own or
Oh,
not?
definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And when Cameron McIntosh asked me to do the London version of Follies, I did not want to go back there and do that show again. Of course, he made tons of changes. They all did. But Michael, on his deathbed, said to me, Bobby, do this. It's your entree to your solo career.
Mm.
And you know the show, you know the characters. Just go ahead and do it. And so I did, and luckily it was my matchup with Cameron McIntosh.
Right.
And that worked out to be great. And the Follies experience again in London was never the show I wanted to be, but it was good enough. But like the first production, it's almost.
Right.
But it worked out all right, and I was happy with it ultimately.
And so it really was your step into your solo career, and at the same time, it started your connection with Cameron, which has
Yeah.
exists now is decades long, and it led to Miss Saigon. And I just thought it was so amusing in kind of a great way when you Follies, I think, had not even opened, and Cameron said to you, "Oh, I want you to choreograph Miss Saigon." Do I have that
Yes.
right?
And he hadn't hired anybody else yet, not the director or anything. And I said to him, I said, you don't even know me. I said, why do you want me for the show? I don't understand. He said, I know. And that was it. And I was so flattered and so pleased. I went, well, of course I got to do it,
Right. Right. And it led you. I want to talk a little bit about the show-stopping American Dream number, but before that, you did have a few moments, I think, where you said, "How do I make big production numbers out of songs that are extolling the virtues of communism?"
It, it was a tough assignment.
Yeah.
My two big production numbers, one dealt with the takeover of communism to South Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
That was the root of it. and the other one was about American capitalism. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, give me a break. This is not take back your mink, you know. And I really had to struggle to find the ideas and whatever. Although one of my best ideas in The American Dream, I can't take solo credit. John Napier, early in the production, the designer, said, could you use an American Cadillac at any point? And I went, I don't think so, but let me put it in my head. And of course, I did, and it was the piece de resistance. But it was like going through the challenges of that show was very interesting and very challenging, very challenging.
Well, I thought, you know, everybody who is with a creative impulse, you never quite know exactly where the idea is going to come from or what form it's going to take. And with the American Dream number, you said, wasn't it a television commercial that gave you an idea?
Yes, I was sitting in my flat in London during the rehearsals, and I was watching a television show called 30 something, and the leading lady goes into a limo and they shut the door and the camera closes up on her and she goes, the American Dream. And I went, well, that's it. Well, where's that Cadillac they were telling me about? And of course it became the climax of the number.
Right, right. Yeah. And so after Saigon, how many years later, roughly, did you do Sunset Boulevard?
Ooh, I don't know. I was doing so many productions of Miss Saigon around the world.
Right.
Every country I was speaking a new language, you know, doing it again. Let's see. From the original production of Saigon, that was 89. Sunset Boulevard was 93, 4 years later.
Okay. And you know, that some again, so much written about Sunset Boulevard productions around the world, and I was struck by the fact you talked about every one of those leading ladies brought something different to the role, a different strength.
Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. And it was fascinating to work with them also
Yeah.
because of that, and to see all their own inventions.
Right.
And it's quite a part, you know, for an actress, biting their way into that part is just very exciting to watch.
Yeah, and I think so. Different values and strengths of the show came out with the
Yeah,
different leading ladies,
yeah.
and I think certainly hearing Patty sing that score was extraordinary.
Oh, yeah. And Patty's one of our closest friends.
Right.
So we knew a lot of what was going on when
Right.
she started. And she started early with this workshop production that Andrew does at his summer home.
Mm-hmm.
He has a church, converted church on his turned into sort of a workshop theater. And they did a whole sort of production of the show. And I saw the videotape, and she was magnificent vocally. It was astounding. And then they cast her. And then I got the call. And so we were two happy campers in London, you know, doing the show together. So,
Kent, Connecticut, and London.
Yeah, yeah.
So Bob, just a couple more questions before. I'm sure people listening are going to have questions for you, but I had a couple more for you, and that is that it struck me, you and I talked about the fact, in a way, your career has had three separate acts to it. Act one, a performer; act two, all the shows with Michael; and then act three on your own. And it struck me, actually, after we finished the book, that act three on your own has been the longest of all of the three acts.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Oh, good. That's nice to know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I thought you might be interested in that.
Yeah.
And I think I was hoping you could talk a little bit about when we uh, were putting the book together, and we decided that great as all the stories are, we didn't just want it to be, and then I did this show, and then I did that show. That the point, one of the big points underneath it is you yourself, you came up with it, and you said, I'm a late bloomer. And, you know, talking about the fact that you had won 2 Tony Awards before you went off on your own. And I think the reason why I wanted you to talk about it a little bit is we all want to think we can have an act 2 in our life. You know, we can switch directions, and just talk about that, and, you know, what it is in you that allowed you to say, I'm going to do this. I'm stepping through the new door.
I it sort of took me by surprise because of the first show being Follies, and then establishing my relationship with Cameron McIntosh.
Mhm.
And he basically grabbed my hand and dragged me to do his other shows, which were, you know, Witches of Eastwick and Martin Gare, and putting it together, 2 different versions, that he was my new Michael Bennett in a way as a producer.
Right.
And he just believed in me, and I went, this has happened again for me. I'm so lucky. And he's been so nice to me. And it just worked. We got along so well. And that's what makes it work. You know, when you're happy to be under that tent with the people you like.
Right.
Of course, I was in London for almost 13 years doing one show after the other. So I didn't know how I would feel about that, but it was great. It was great.
And you had this, you know, have had and continue to have this extraordinary run with Cameron, and yet there was a whole nother cap to it when you directed on Broadway for the first time with the revival of Chorus Line. And there you are with your solo credit on Broadway as a director. Did that, did you feel that brought you to a new level, or how did you feel about that?
I don't know. John Brelio, our producer and a good friend, you know, said, Bobby, we're going to do Chorus Line again on Broadway, a revival, and you'll be directing it. I mean, there was no question, will you do it? Won't you do it? In John's eyes, I was doing it. And I thought to myself, yeah, I guess I am, you know. So we got the great team together, Byork Lee, my husband, Peter Pilevsky, and all the Natasha Richardsons or whatever, and Patrick Vacariello, our conductor. And it was a great team. And it was interesting to do it again because in all these years, I would hire all the replacements, do all the rehearsals, but I never actually directed a production of the show.
Hmm.
And, you know, Byork Lee did many of them, but
Right.
I never did one. And here I go, my debut on Broadway. Well, here's hoping, you know. But it worked out fine. We had a good time. And we've done it several times more, you know, tours. We did a New London a few years ago, which was great. And Old Man River keeps on going. But yeah, it's fun.
Well, I think I could keep asking you questions about these extraordinary shows for a very long time. But I know people have questions which they can write in the chat room, and then I'll try to read them out for you. But I think, Bob, before we start with the questions, um, the part of the interview I wanted to just quickly do now is what I like to call the subtle and artistic portion of the evening, which is, let's remind everybody that signed copies of the book signed by you are available at House of Books.
Thank you, Tom. Well said.
And it's hopefully people will find it a great read, and you can contact House of Books in Kent, Connecticut. The books are signed by Bob. And so now I will look at, if people want to start putting in questions, I'll read one to you, Bob. Oh, well, here's a question that isn't about a show, but it says, Bob, what originally drew you to Kent, Connecticut, and why have you stayed here?
Oh, I originally started down in Brookfield, New Milford. I just wanted a weekend house to get away. And this was like 1972, believe it or not. And but within 3 years I was down there. It became so congested and overpopulated. Friends told me, well, if you go up Route 7, there's a nice town called Kent. Why don't you check that out? So as I've used this line before, when I thought I was near the Canadian border, I wound up in Kent, Connecticut. and this was the place. And I've been here since 1975.
Wow. Wow. It's home.
Yes, it is home.
And here's a showbiz question for you. In the book, Paul Marty writes, in the book, you touch on yours and Michael's work on TV variety shows. Can you elaborate what that was like?
Well, we did the standard ones, you know, like Ed Sullivan Show. We did that quite a few times. I did it by myself a few times. And Hallmark Hall of Fame specials, things like that. The most fun we had were doing Stephen Eady concerts with the orchestras up there and all these ramps. And Stephen Eady would just sit there in chairs looking at the set while Michael and I would be Stephen Eady. And just we'd walking all over the set singing the songs. And then they would just get up and copy us. I never had so much fun. It was great.
I love that. And the fact that you worked with Gina Lollobrigida, who had a tiger on a leash.
Yeah.
Bob, a couple more showbiz questions. Can you talk about the old gals who were in Follies, especially Fifi D'Orsay, who sang À Paris?
They were a handful. And, you know, rehearsals for them were very tough because just being on your feet all day and the memory not working so well. But my favorite story is when the day came when we were going to work with Ethel Chute on Broadway, Baby. So Ethel, come on in and let's start. Why don't you just sing it for us first? She had worked out every move, every ad lib, every bit of shtick, and did the whole number complete. And we never changed one thing. From change, you know, to her kicks or whatever, she had it down and she did it. And it was magic. Those were the magic times, you know. But other than that, it was hard sometimes. And the show was on a rake stage, so they were having trouble maneuvering. But we kept it up, you know.
And you had the pedometer to clock how many miles you were making. Yes. Here's a related question from John Brailio about how do you compare the young dancers today with the dancers from the 60s and the 70s?
Well, there's so much further along in their training. When dancers from that period, I'm not saying all, but the majority, you know, you had a ballet technique and a jazz technique and maybe tap, but it was contained. Now these dancers come in, I swear they spin on their heads, they're doing backflips, they're amazing. And their training is so much more thorough and complete. And plus they all can sing now and everything. I'd never get a job today if I were a dancer. I'd pale by far next to all these people.
I suspect you would get a job, but we'll let you say that.
I don't know.
Bob, here's a question. How was the book writing process compared to working in the theater?
Well, I just have to say to everybody here, Tom wrote the book and he took my words and turned it into something lovely. And Peter, my husband, had a lot to do with the formation of it as well. And Tom, you just made it such a pleasure. I appreciate it so much. And you were so wonderful to me.
Well,
And so that's much nicer than working in the theater.
and you know, Bob, I only had to pay you $100 to say something like
I
that.
know, I know.
Here's an interesting question. What has been your proudest theatrical accomplishment?
Oh my goodness. I don't know. I don't know. I can't think of one specifically, interestingly, but no.
And I'm looking to see as I'm scrolling through here. There are requests for you to sign the book. And here's the question. Do you think your personality has helped you work successfully with so many people? How would you describe your temperament?
I would describe my temperament as very even. And you have to be open. You have to be accepting of everybody's ideas, whether you agree with them or not. You have to be generous in your heart and mind about this creative process. Because if they weren't talented, they wouldn't be in the room with you. And everybody has something to say. I think the flexibility is most important.
Right, right. What, and here's it's maybe it's sort of a corollary to that. That question was from Brooke Allen. This is from somebody else. And the question is, regrets? Do you have any regrets, Bob?
No, I think I have been so fortunate and so lucky and have had a career that is sustained to my old age. To link up with Michael Bennett for all those years was something special. I would never have become a choreographer if it weren't for him or gone on with a career. It was sort of a match made in heaven artistically. And I just let it come, as I say in the book, if a door opened, I went through it. Right. and saw what's this about? What's going to happen?
Well, I think an interesting, these, it's sort of, your answers are feeding very nicely into the next question that pops up on the side of the screen. And here's one I don't think we've ever talked about. The question is from Ernie Peischer. Is there a moment in one of your shows where you think, oh, I wish I would have done this differently every time you see the number?
Every show. I mean, you always go, oh my God, I could have done this, I could have done that. And you do change them if you get another chance. Yes. Yeah. I never think of a show as being frozen, as they say, once it is open. And because I've done so many shows that have transferred from London to New York or New York to London, I've had the chance to do that. And so much has to do with your cast and what they're capable of.
And so, well, you talked about the fact that you then made changes in Sunset Boulevard over the course of the different productions. And
oh, yes, yes. And of course, with all the different leading ladies. I mean, there's a foundation you follow, but you have to go with the flow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, here's a great question from Kenneth Kleinrock. It says, Bob, you have so much experience and talent. There are so many challenges facing the future of live theater, given what's happening in our nation. What's next for you?
Oh, retirement is next. I'm getting too old to kick my legs, that's for sure. But I love having a history, and I love still being part of it and having so many friends who are in the business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lifelong friends who you've continued to work with, like Bjork and John Brailio, and yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And just a couple more questions before we end. Let's see, Joe Posa says, I so enjoyed your book. Thanks for sharing your story. I love the documentary film, Every Little Step. What was that experience like being followed by a film crew?
Oh, well, it was a limited crew of a cameraman, a sound man, and a director. In the beginning, during the auditions for Chorus Line, it was so intimidating. The first thing in the morning, they'd come in and clip a microphone on you, and someone was listening to you all day long. You know, whether you were directing or just gossiping or whatever. But after a couple of weeks, you just have to get on with it. You just do it.
Right.
But it was hard. It was very hard.
And didn't you find out that when the show was in, I think, Houston, that former President George H.W. Bush had seen the documentary?
Oh, yes. We went to an opening night of one of our tours, and they put us right in front of George, Peter and I, right in front of George and Barbara Bush. And they're fans of the show. And they were fans of the film, Every Little Step. So the stage manager introduced me to George and Barbara. And George said, "Hey, you're the man. You're the man. This is your show." And I went, "Thank you, Mr. President. I really enjoyed that."
Hello and welcome back. So what an amazing journey we just had. I hope you all enjoyed delving into the theatrical world of Broadway and many of the stages from around the world with Bob Avian. Thank you for joining us tonight, and look forward to your invite for FAB's next FAB Presents, which will be our annual meeting on March 23rd. Our special performing guest will be the Gold Coast Jazz Group. So until then, have a wonderful evening, and thank you for your support of FAB. Good night.